Good day to all. Today I will tell you about the most dangerous criminal in America of the 20th century, Jack Raford, who kept all of America in fear. Jack Radford was born in Chicago in 1912 into an extremely poor family. His parents, Elizabeth and William Radford, struggled to survive by working in factories and doing whatever they could. Even in such conditions, they tried to give their son the best that was in their power. Jack spent his childhood in the slums of Chicago, where life was tough and merciless. He grew up around street gangs and crime, where survival required strength and cunning. From a young age, Jack learned to fight for himself and his family, often finding himself in situations where he had to make difficult decisions. Although his parents tried to raise him to be a decent person, his environment had a strong influence on him. Jack quickly realized that in a world ruled by the laws of force, he must be stronger and more cunning to survive. Jack Radford was indeed the poorest of all in his class. His clothes were shabby and his dinners were modest. He was a quiet and shy boy who often got lost among his classmates. His quiet nature became a target for bullying and insults. The other children, seeing his vulnerability, began to tease and bully him. They mocked his clothes, mocked his poverty and the fact that he often spent time alone. Jack tried to ignore the bullying, but each new attack left a scar in his heart. However, among all the difficulties at school, Jack discovered something in himself that made him stand out: intelligence and intelligence. He was a quiet observer who noticed a lot and understood a lot. This talent helped him survive in a harsh environment where the strongest ruled by force. Jack's teenage years were a period of self-learning and self-discovery. He learned about cruelty and mercilessness, but also discovered strength and determination. As he grew older, his reputation as a man not to be trifled with became increasingly known in Chicago crime circles. One day, through a series of unfortunate circumstances, Jack found himself completely drawn into the criminal world. His skill with people and his ability to anticipate their actions made him a valuable player in this dangerous game. He quickly climbed the criminal ladder to become one of the most dangerous criminals in America. The story of Bloody Jack Radford became the subject of fear and admiration. It was woven into legends and anecdotes, spreading from generation to generation. Jack met his love. Her name was Amelia. She was the one bright spot in his life. Their love was as unusual as it was deep. When Amelia became pregnant and they were to become parents of twins, Jack felt happier than ever before. But fate had its own plans. One ordinary day when Amelia was crossing the street, she was hit by a bus. Jack, stunned by the loss of his lover and future children, found himself on the verge of madness. This shock turned his world upside down, filling his heart with bitterness and rage. Now Jack felt deceived by life, anger towards the world, which took away everything that was dear to him. He became even more ruthless and dangerous, his heart hardened by pain and loss. Now, Bloody Jack Radford has become even more unpredictable and dangerous to others. After the loss of Amelia and future children, Jack Radford was overcome with a feeling of hopelessness and anger. He shut himself up in his own world, filled only with darkness and pain. The thirst for revenge consumed him, and his mind became clouded with the desire to take revenge on the world for the loss of everything he held dear. Dark thoughts of revenge and bloodlust permeated his mind, forcing him to act with ruthless determination. He became even more cold-blooded and brutal in his actions, and his reputation as a dangerous criminal only increased. Jack decided that the whole world should pay for his loss. He began to act mercilessly, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in his wake. His victims became pawns in his game of revenge, and he himself became more and more unpredictable and dangerous. Thus began a new chapter in the history of Bloody Jack Radford, a chapter filled with cruelty and madness that will forever go down in the annals of American crime. As Jack plunged deeper into the dark world of crime, He began to search for the truth behind the death of his lover. At every step he encountered resistance and mysterious obstacles, but his determination did not weaken. Eventually, through his connections and resources, he found out that the bus driver who hit his wife had indeed not been held accountable. It turned out that the driver's relatives were rich and influential people who used their connections and money to avoid punishment. This discovery caused Jack's rage to reach its peak. He realized that laws were unjust and that the rich could evade responsibility for their actions. Tormented by painful rage and a thirst for revenge, Jack decided that the laws were not for him. He became a man that the world should fear. He became a force against the corrupt system. He spent every day searching for justice, but his own definition of justice became increasingly distorted by his anger and madness. Fueled by a sick rage and a thirst for revenge, Jack Radford decided that the only way to achieve justice was to kill the driver who killed his pregnant wife. This decision was the result of years of pent-up anger and resentment, and Jack was willing to go to any lengths to avenge his loss. He carefully planned his act of revenge, using all his skills and resources to ensure the success of the operation. Every detail was carefully considered, every step calculated to minimize risk and ensure maximum efficiency. When the moment came, Jack began to execute his plan. He acted quickly and mercilessly, without giving himself time to think or hesitate. His heart was full of rage, and he was ready to shed blood to satisfy his anger. Jack Radford decided that the driver's death should not just be an act of revenge, but also a sign of his contempt for the corrupt system. He developed a daring and cunning plan to destroy the driver, using his own methods against him. The driver often stopped at one of the small cafes on the outskirts of the city after finishing his shift. Jack knew about this place and decided to use it as a trap. He bribed one of the cafe workers to help him carry out his plan. One evening, when the driver was about to leave the cafe, he discovered that his car would not start. Approaching the car to check what happened, he noticed that something was wrong in the engine compartment. At this time, Jack, hidden in the shadows, crept up behind him. Seconds later, the driver felt the cold metal of a knife at his throat. Jack emerged from the shadows, smiling in victory. He was in no hurry. He was enjoying the moment, knowing that he now held in his power the man who had deprived him of everything. Jack then directed the driver towards dark alleys where they were out of sight of witnesses. There he carried out his act of revenge, relentlessly driving a knife through the heart of the corrupt system that took his family from him. This act was not just murder, it was a sign of contempt for those who considered themselves above the law. Jack Radford was a competent and cunning criminal. He knew how to cover his tracks and remain invisible to the law. Every step was thought out to the smallest detail. Every action was performed with impeccable precision. The crime scene was carefully selected and all evidence was destroyed. The local police, faced with such difficulties, began to feel powerless. Vague witness statements and a lack of physical evidence made the case even more difficult. Each new investigation led to a dead end, and the police began to realize that they were dealing with an enemy who was ahead of them at every step. However, this did not stop them in their search for justice. With each passing day, Bloody Jack's growing list of victims only made the police more determined. They used all their resources and skills to find at least some evidence that would lead them to him. But Jack Radford continued to remain an uncaught ghost. He knew that his freedom depended on his ability to hide in the shadows, and he was willing to use any means to maintain his integrity. As the police continued to investigate the case unsuccessfully, Jack Radford continued his criminal activities as if nothing had happened. He became increasingly bold, choosing new targets and avoiding any attempts at arrest. Meanwhile, the public was in panic. Each new criminal, whose death ended his criminal activity, increased fear and anxiety. Bloody Jack became the embodiment of a nightmare for the residents of Chicago. Their fear only intensified with each new crime. The police, in a desperate attempt to stop him, began to use all their resources. They created a special crime-fighting team that worked around the clock to try to track down Jack. But even the most thorough investigations and large-scale operations did not bring the desired result. For Jack Radford, this was just an additional challenge. He continued his game with the police, finding new ways to avoid them and staying one step ahead. His legend as America's most dangerous criminal grew darker and more mystical, and no law could stop him. With each new disappearance associated with Bloody Jack, public outrage and concern only increased. Police could not ignore the obvious connections between these disappearances and Jack Radford's past crimes. Over the past 5 years, 27 people have gone missing, and all traces pointed to Jack. But even with all the confidence of the police, it was extremely difficult to find direct evidence that would lead to an arrest. Jack was a master of disguise and destroyed all evidence associated with him. Meanwhile, society demanded answers. The press fanned the scandal, and politicians promised decisive action. There was tension and fear on the streets of Chicago. Every day, as news of the next disappearance spread throughout the city, the hearts of the residents sank with fear and helplessness. The police were under enormous pressure. Their reputation was at stake. But Jack Radford remained an elusive shadow, avoiding the blows of the law and continuing his bloody game. Jack Radford, experiencing bitterness and rage, decided that not only the driver was guilty, but also his wealthy relatives, who bought him out of punishment. Preparation for this operation took him a whole year. He carefully studied each of the driver's relatives, found out their regular movements, habits, and daily schedule. Jack understood that for a successful operation he needed to know his enemies better than they themselves. Gradually, he developed his plan. He produced false documents, created an alibi, and prepared his weapons. He studied every detail, considered every possible scenario, and prepared for every possible obstacle. And when the day came, Jack Radford acted with the cool determination and skill of a surgeon. He plunged into the darkness of the night, leaving behind only traces of chaos and destruction. Every action was carried out with such precision that even the most vigilant observers could not detect his presence. Jack Radford, in his revenge, decided to take an approach that would leave traces of fear and terror in the hearts of his victims. He knew he had to let them know that none of them could escape their destiny. One day, when the driver's relatives gathered for a regular family dinner in their luxurious country mansion, Jack waylaid them. He infiltrated the house using his camouflage skills and carefully studied the layout of the premises. And suddenly, when they were at the peak of their serenity, Jack attacked. He appeared before them like a ghost from a nightmare, armed with his tools of vengeance. Fear welled up in their hearts as they realized that they were about to die in a terrible way that they had never imagined. Jack killed them one by one, each murder carefully planned and executed with ruthless precision. He left behind only a trail of blood and a terrifying hallmark that said that Bloody Jack Radford would carry out his revenge to the very end. The police, stunned by the cruelty and cunning of Bloody Jack Radford, once again launched a huge investigation. They turned to all possible sources of information, but not a single trace led them to Jack. Every move, every new piece of evidence proved useless. Jack Radford, in turn, understood that time was his best ally. He hid in the shadows, avoiding patrols and following the police's every move. He became an invisible ghost who was ready to strike at any moment when he was not expected. Time passed, and Bloody Jack continued his criminal activities in other parts of the city. His traces disappeared like grains of sand in the wind, and even the most skilled investigators could not find him. Meanwhile, fear and mistrust took hold of the city. Every evening when the sun set, people locked themselves in their houses, afraid that Bloody Jack might be waiting for them in the dark corners of the city. But even in his hiding place, Jack knew that his time had not yet come, and he was ready to continue his game with the police until the very end. Panic gripped Chicago. turning it into a city shrouded in fear and mistrust. Everyone, from young to old, lived in constant tension, fearing that they would be Bloody Jack's next victim. Under the cover of night, the city turned into a place where a dark shadow reigned. The streets were empty, and the residents, wary and suspicious, looked around, fearing to meet the terrible face of their tormentor. No place seemed safe, and each new person who disappeared deepened the panic and despair. The police fought against a merciless enemy, whose actions became more and more cunning and daring. Despite all their efforts, they encountered obstacles that seemed insurmountable. None of their plans and operations brought the desired result. And all this time, Bloody Jack Radford continued his dark game. He knew that police attention would be directed at him, and he used this to his advantage. His murders became more and more sophisticated, and his traces became increasingly disappearing. Chicago was consumed by fear, and no one knew when the nightmare that had been going on for an eternity would end. The detective who came to Chicago to catch Bloody Jack Radford was named Edward Lawrence. He was known for his keen mind, cool head, and meticulous analytical approach to crime investigation. His surname became a symbol of the fight for justice, and his name was widely known in the criminal world. Edward Lawrence was the kind of detective who stopped at nothing to achieve his goal. His ability to see hidden connections and decipher complex criminal mysteries made him the best in the business. He was a true master of the art of investigation, and his presence in Chicago raised hopes that Bloody Jack would be caught and brought to justice. Edward Lawrence carefully studied all aspects of the activities of Bloody Jack Radford. He analyzed every crime, every trace, trying to find some clue that would help solve the mystery of this mysterious criminal. One day, during his investigation, Lawrence noticed a common pattern present in most of the murders committed by Jack. He noted that all the victims had some connections with corrupt members of society, wealthy and powerful individuals who could provide immunity from the law. This aspect of Jack's crimes gave Lawrence the idea that the criminal was seeking revenge for those who harbored and protected him. He began to look at murder cases from this point of view, and his mind penetrated to the very essence of the dark game played by Jack. During his investigation, Lawrence came across connections between the relatives of one of the influential rich people and the victims who fell under Jack's onslaught. He discovered some implicit connections that seemed defenseless, but in the end became the key to the solution. This discovery gave Lawrence new hope and energy in his fight against crime. He was willing to use all his knowledge and resources to bring his investigation to the end and bring Bloody Jack Radford to justice. Edward Lawrence, with the help of his new discovery about the connections between the relatives of a rich and powerful man and the victims of Bloody Jack Radford, began to develop his strategy to catch the criminal. Realizing that Jack's crimes were motivated by revenge for a corrupt system, Lawrence decided to use this against him. He began to develop a plan in which he himself became bait for Jack. Using his experience and resources, Lawrence created the illusion that he was Jack's next victim. He did everything to attract the criminal's attention and challenge him to a duel. Lawrence was sure that Jack would not be able to resist the temptation to take revenge on him, and his strategy worked. One cold autumn evening, when the streets of Chicago were shrouded in darkness, Jack Radford succumbed to temptation and swam out of his hiding place. He kept an eye on Lawrence, wanting to complete his work and erase traces of his crimes forever. However, when Jack finally went hunting, he discovered that he himself had become the victim. Lawrence, with the help of his agents and covert operations, surrounded him, and Jack had no way to escape. Ruthless and merciless, the forces of law closed the net around Bloody Jack, and it was only a matter of time before he was captured. This meeting was the culmination of a long hunt, and Edward Lawrence was able to bring the criminal to justice. The great panic caused by Bloody Jack had come to an end, and Chicago was able to feel like a safe city again. As the investigation progressed, Edward Lawrence discovered a surprising but horrifying truth. The number of murders committed by Bloody Jack Radford was beyond anyone's expectations. He had as many as 53 murders to his name, each of which was carried out with ruthless precision and composure. This shocking information baffled not only Lawrence, but the entire police team. They understood that they were dealing with a real monster whose crimes went far beyond ordinary murders. Each new detail made the picture more and more creepy. However, Lawrence was resolute in his desire to bring Jack to justice. He used this discovery as further impetus for his investigation, seeking to not only catch the culprit, but also to ensure that he could not terrorize the city again. With every new piece of evidence, every new witness, Lawrence moved closer to his goal. He knew it was important for Chicago to regain security and peace, and he was willing to do anything to achieve it. And his determination and dedication led to Jack Radford being eventually caught and brought to justice, and the city once again free of his sinister presence. After years of hunting and intense investigation, Edward Lawrence and the cops were able to bring Bloody Jack Radford to face justice. He was found guilty of 53 murders and sentenced to death. That dark day when Jack Radford was torn to pieces by bullets was the end of his dark era and a great relief for the people of Chicago. The death of Bloody Jack brought an end to the nightmare that had plagued the city for many years. Edward Lawrence and his team were able to restore peace and order to Chicago, and his skill and dedication became a symbol of the fight for justice. The city was able to feel like a safe place again, where law and order had been restored. The death of Bloody Jack Radford served as a warning to all those who thought about committing crimes. His story became a lesson, reminding everyone that even the most cunning and cruel criminals will inevitably be punished for their actions. Thus ended the story of Bloody Jack Radford, Chicago's most dangerous criminal, whose terrible mark left a deep scar on the city's history, but whose capture and execution brought the end of darkness and the beginning of a new era of security and peace. If you watched to the end, please subscribe to the channel and like it. This will greatly help promote my channel. See you soon.